the legacy you leave can be better than the legacy you received. Sometimes in the last laps around the track, it's easy to get sloppy. Narcissism, where the world shrinks. You start to feel like it ought to all revolve around you. Pessimism, you become convinced that your best days and the world's best days are all in the rearview mirror. Fatalism, you just take your foot off the gas. Take your hands off the wheel. Figure it doesn't really matter how you live anymore anyway. Obviously, that's not a recipe for a life that finishes full. Abraham, on the other hand, runs his final lap and completes the handoff with two big realizations I want us to look at today that keep him away from those black holes of narcissism and pessimism and fatalism. If you got a Bible today, go ahead and grab it and meet me in Genesis 25. Genesis 25 is where we're going to be today for our final message in this teaching series through the life of the story of the life of a guy named Abraham. We've called the series Altered. Genesis 25 is where we are going to be today as we wrap this series up. Genesis 25. If the story of the U.S. men's 4x100 relay team from our generation is ever told, it's hard to know if the story will be a tragedy or a comedy. Whatever it is, it's safe to say that the story of our generation's 4x100 relay team is going to be a story that goes down in history for all the wrong reasons. Going back all the way to 2005, 7 of the last 11 Olympics and world champions in which the U.S. men's had a team that was favored to win it all, 7 of the last 11, they failed to finish or were disqualified. They can't get the handoff right, to the point that everybody notices. Saturday Night Live has noticed, perhaps you've seen those skits. But it's not just them, it's highly academic doctoral dissertations from sports psychologists who have noticed something is wrong. The great Olympian Carl Lewis, he has an opinion as to why it was. I read an article not too long ago from him where he thinks that the reason that they can't get it right is that they wait too long to practice the handoff. He says the handoff is very little about the actual moment of the handoff. It's all about the form and the technique leading all the way up to the moment and then leading away from the moment. It's all about the way that you run and the way that you start, the way that you finish, the way that you hold your hand and the way that you reach the baton and the way that you put the baton in the hand all comes together for the moment that has very little to do with the moment. Any breakdown in the form and the fundamentals along the way can cause a fumbled handoff. And everything's working against it. You may know the runner that's finishing their leg is tired mentally and physically, which makes it really easy for form to get sloppy. And the runner that's starting their leg is energetic and amped up with the adrenaline, which makes it easy for the form to get sloppy. If you wait too long to think about it, if you're not prepared for it, the baton can get dropped in the moment. Turns out it's not just true of men's 4x100 relay teams, it's true of legacies, especially when it comes to the legacy of blessing and promise. Sometimes it seems like everything is working against the handoff. Crowd noise, energy, fatigue, fear. Makes it easy to fumble the baton. People that are finishing the race are tired. It's easy for form to get sloppy. People that are starting the race are energetic. It's easy for form to get sloppy. You can run a great race with jaw-dropping form and all the talent in the world right up to the last moment. In a race like this one, the finish matters just as much as the form all along. And for your sake, for the sake of the next generation, you want to get the handoff right. Speaking of the finish, look at the last words on Abraham's life. Genesis chapter 25, verse 8. Sort of like the description of how Abraham crosses the finish line. Genesis 25, verse 8, say this. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. And he was gathered to his people. You notice those words, full of years? Our English translations have added the words of years to smooth out the translation from Hebrew to English. For us, it sounds weird just to say he died, an old man and full. But that's what the Hebrew says. It's actually a word that some of you will use to describe yourself here in a couple of weeks. The end of a Thanksgiving meal. You sit back, loosen up the belt, take a deep sigh, and think, I am full. But in a good way, not after you've crossed the edge into miserable, just content and happy, stuffed, satisfied. That's the word. That's how Abraham crossed the finish line. It's not just quantity of years. He had a whole lot of birthdays and then he died. It's better than that. It's a quality with which he died. Satisfied, full, content. I'm not sure how you're planning to go out. That seems like a pretty good way to go, doesn't it? Get to the end of your life and feel full and satisfied and content. So it feels worth asking, what does it look like? How do you get there? How do you prepare to go like that? And as we wrap up our look at Abraham's life, the last couple of scenes in his story, I think you see a guy who has his eyes focused on the finish and really focused on the handoff. And it turns out way before he finishes his leg of the race. In fact, flip back to Genesis chapter 23 for a moment. Genesis 23. Last week we saw Abraham's final exam in Genesis 22. He's navigated this broken world and emerged more faithful than he started. Certainly not perfectly. He hasn't navigated much in his life perfectly. We've seen that all the way along. It's not that he gets to the end of his story and he's satisfied and full and content because he doesn't have regrets. If you followed the story, he's got a lot of things to regret. A lot of broken pieces around Abraham. A lot of broken pieces within Abraham. But again, that's the picture that Abraham's altered life gives us. Broken pieces put together to point to the faithfulness of God. That's what an altar is. It's what Abraham's life is. Yet the truth is, if Abraham lives his whole 175-year life with perfect form, if he lives his life, all of the brokenness and the blessing that we've seen, but he gets to the end and he gets tired, or he gets to the end and he gets sloppy, and he botches the final lap, or he botches the handoff, none of us would have ever heard of him. I want to argue, in large part because of the way he prepared to finish the race. 4,000 years after his life, his legacy lives on. Maybe to give a different contrast, I heard Charles Swindoll say a few years ago. Charles Swindoll is 88 years old right now. Just a few years ago, I heard him say that he refused to ever become an old person. And he refused to ever spend time around old people. Here's what he said. He said, old people, in his mind, are people who are marked by three unfortunate characteristics. Here's how he defines an old person. An old person's defined by narcissism, and by pessimism, and by fatalism. Okay, don't email me, take it up with Chuck. Narcissism, pessimism, fatalism. It's a different way of talking about this observation that sometimes in the last laps around the track, it's easy to get sloppy. Narcissism, where the world shrinks. You start to feel like it ought to all revolve around you. Pessimism. You become convinced that your best days and the world's best days are all in the rearview mirror. Fatalism. You just take your foot off the gas. Take your hands off the wheel. Figure it doesn't really matter how you live anymore anyway. Obviously, that's not a recipe for a life that finishes full. Abraham, on the other hand, runs his final lap and completes the handoff with two big realizations I want us to look at today that keep him away from those black holes of narcissism and pessimism and fatalism. Look at the first one, Genesis chapter 23, verse 1. It says, Sarah lived to be 127 years old. You know, and this is the only time in the scriptures that a woman's age is given. Here it is. Verse 2, she died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites, and he said, I'm a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so that I can bury my dead. So a couple of things to notice here. First, Sarah died when she was 127. Abraham was 10 years older than her. That means he was 137 years old. So we read that and get a sense of how old he is in this moment and talk about final lap. We got to be thinking final steps here for Abraham, right? You realize he would live another 40 years after this moment? So this realization that we're going to look at that he has, not just a realization for the year or two when you're so old everyone knows you're on your final steps. He's living towards his last lap. He's living towards the handoff with 40 years left in his life. Here's the realization you see him living with, even as he's grieving here. It's this: the life you live will be longer than the breath you breathe. The life you live will be longer than the breath you breathe. I told you this is the only time that a woman's age is given in the Bible. This is the first time in the Bible that you read about somebody being buried. People have been born and died up to this point in Genesis. Sarah's the first person that gets a burial. And scholars think that's significant, that the narrator's telling us something in that. Doesn't mean that people didn't bury people before this, but drawing it out is saying something about what Abraham's doing here. He goes to this guy Ephron, who has a cave that's near the altar that Abraham built in Genesis chapter 13. The one he keeps coming back to all through the story. And it's clear throughout the whole chapter that he wants more than just a place to bury his wife. If you've ever been to that part of the world, you know there are caves that are dotted all over the landscape there. Thousands and thousands of caves. He could have just picked one if all he wanted was a place to bury his wife. Could have had it for free. They're everywhere. He comes to this one. He's looking for something permanent. He wants a deed to this cave, in this spot, in this land. The place that she'll be buried. The place that he'll be buried. the place that Isaac will be buried. He doesn't know it yet. The place that Isaac's son Jacob, Jacob's son Joseph will all be buried. Or you might say, planted. Abraham is planting his wife near the altar, saying, in life and in death, I don't ever want to move away from here. I want to stay in this place. Why? Well, because Hebrews chapter 11 tells us Abraham believes there's going to be a resurrection. He can't possibly be able to put together the pieces. 4,000 years later, we got a lot more pieces to the puzzle to understand how and why, and someday when, what that will look like. But Abraham knows that there's more to the promise. He knows there's more to the blessing. He knows that there's more to his life than just his life. And he's making all of his decisions towards that destination. And it comes out in the negotiation with Ephron. Ephron says, hey man, you can use my cave. Like, what's a cave between friends, you know? I'll just give it to you. But Abraham insists in purchasing it. He wants the deed. Why? Well, it's a little like going to your neighbor, saying, hey, could I buy just a little sliver of your property? Because I want to extend my garage out so that I can get my car inside the garage. And the neighbor is saying, oh, we don't have to do that. Just park your car in my garage. I got plenty of room, plenty of space. I mean, that's a super generous offer from your neighbor, isn't it? You're probably going to refuse the offer. Why? Well, any number of reasons that you might refuse the offer. Like one, what if the neighbor moves? What if the neighbor has to relocate? They get transferred and they go. Somebody else takes over the house. How do you know they're going to be as generous as your neighbor? What if you and your neighbor have a falling out while your car's in their garage? What do you do then? You're going to owe your neighbor a favor, and then another favor, and then another favor. You're going to keep owing your neighbor favors if the land doesn't belong to you. Abraham wants a piece of land that's his possession, so that no matter what, when resurrection happens, he's rising in the land that God's planted him in and promised to him. He's doing what Jesus calls laying up treasures in heaven. And he ends up overpaying for a cave so that he can drop an anchor in the land he was promised, embracing that the land he was made for is this one, even though he doesn't fully experience the promise yet. You see that? He's living his life as if this life is not the sum total of this life. And I wonder about you. Not just those of you that are maybe on your final lap and know it. Those of you that may have 40 or 50 or 60 years left to run. What decisions would you make today if you were completely convinced that your life would be longer than the breath you breathe? How would you invest your money? I mean, that's in that story, isn't it? Sure. But here in this story, it's also there. Where would you put your focus? How would you deal with grief and brokenness? Some of the hardest things that life can throw at a person. If you believe that the life you live would be longer than the breath you breathe. Because the scriptures teach for all of us, that's where this thing's headed. This is not all there is. And that's about more than just where you go when you die. It is about that. You have to pay attention to that. But it's also about how you live towards that while you live. That's the first thing you see about Abraham's last lap. The life you live is longer than just the breath you breathe. And Abraham, with 40 years left, decides he's going to run with that in mind. The second thing that you see is in chapter 24. Genesis chapter 24, beginning in verse 1. Says this, now Abraham was very old, and the Lord blessed him in every way. He said to his senior servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, Put your hand under my thigh. Okay. Some of you were here for the cutting of the covenant sermon with Abraham in Genesis 15. We did a little surgery on some stuffed animals. Some of you here for that one? Zero illustrations on this covenant and oath. In fact, I'm going to put my hands in my pocket here. I'm not even going to gesture in the moments ahead when I tell you what's happening here. Abraham says to his servant, "Put your hand under my thigh and swear." So that means exactly what you're afraid that it means. Junior high guys, means exactly what you're hoping I'm about to have to tell you that it means. Adam Clark is a commentator and a scholar. I'll let him say it. Here's what he says. He put his hand on the part that bore the mark of circumcision. So why does the Bible tell us that? Maybe more importantly for parents of junior high boys who are in the service today, why is the pastor telling us, including my junior high son, that the Bible tells us that? Okay, here's the funny point. It's actually very serious. Maybe it goes without saying. If a man makes this kind of oath with another person, if a dude makes this kind of oath with another man, it does not get more serious than that. Are you tracking with me, fellas? What is it that Abraham's so serious about here? Well, do you see it? Verse 3, Genesis chapter 24, verse 3. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I'm living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac. This way of swearing an oath actually shows up several times through the Old Testament, and it's always around the covenant of blessing and promise to the next generation, and it's always serious. Abraham's all about making sure that with all of the energy and the strength and the resources he's got left, he puts the next generation in the best possible position to inherit the blessing and live towards the promise. As Abraham gets to the end of his life, he may be continuing to try to grow his business. Genesis doesn't tell us anything about that. He may be still working on his wealth and trying to manage his health. It doesn't tell us anything about that. He's going to get remarried. He's going to have more children. We get a couple of sentences about that. We get the longest chapter in Abraham's story, the longest chapter in the book of Genesis, about Abraham's commitment to making sure that the next generation gets to inherit a better spiritual trajectory than he did. And he is dead serious about it. Here's what he models. It bubbles up all throughout the story. The legacy you leave can be better than the legacy you received. The legacy you leave can be better than the legacy you received. And that's true whatever kind of legacy you received. I mean, all of us receive a legacy that is some combination of blessing and brokenness. Isn't that true? And some of us receive more of one than the other, but all of us get some combination of blessing and brokenness. And you don't control that. You just receive it. It's the legacy you receive. You don't get to control what you're given. That was true of Abraham. Remember how his story starts. I mean, his dad was a moon god worshiper who either had high expectations for his son or a high view of himself as a dad. The name that he gave Abram was either great father or kid with an awesome dad. But that's what Abram grew up with. Abraham's the beginning of a positive spiritual legacy in his family. That's true of a bunch of you in this room. Like your parents did a lot of great things for you. They blessed you in a whole lot of ways. Did the best that they could, but they weren't the ones that showed you or told you that there's a life to live beyond the breath that you breathe. That's starting with you. Maybe there were other blessings, but you're the first in the spiritual legacy of your family. You can leave a better legacy than the one you received. Some of you, and I know because you've told me your stories, there's not a lot of blessing in the legacy you received, a whole lot of brokenness. All of us inherit some combination of that, and all of us are going to leave some combination of that. The point isn't make sure we don't leave any brokenness to our kids who come after us. Isaac's going to inherit some brokenness from his dad. In fact, you don't have to turn the page many times. You see a story of Isaac finding himself in a situation where he's dishonest about whether his wife is his wife or his sister. The same thing he saw his dad do. Isaac inherits some brokenness. The point isn't to make sure that your kids can't possibly screw up the blessing or lose sight of the promise. That's not under your control. The point is to aim all of it in your life and towards their legacy from as early as you realize it towards the faithfulness of one who can carry them wherever they go. Aim it all, blessing and brokenness, the faithfulness of God, to make your life an altar, especially the closer you get to the finish line. So the fundamentals don't begin to get sloppy. What does that look like? Well, it's peppered all throughout the chapter a couple of different times. In Abraham's story, we get allusions to his brokenness, that he realizes where he's come from and he's committed to leaving a better legacy. With his brokenness, what we see is the path of confession. Abraham says to his servant in verse 6, "Don't let Isaac go back where I came from." Later on, the servant says to Rebekah, Abraham had made it really clear to him, don't force something if it's not there. Be patient and trust the Lord. He will deliver on his promise. Abraham has some stories about the brokenness of the alternative, doesn't he? Getting impatient, failing to wait. When it comes to his brokenness, he confesses it. He's clear about it. Part of passing the baton well means an appropriate level of vulnerability about your own brokenness with the next generation. So that the hard, broken pieces come together for them, and they don't have to repeat your spiritual mistakes. With his brokenness, there's confession. With the blessing, there's intention. Abraham is awfully intentional. This chapter starts by saying Abraham was really old, but he's not about to lose focus. Not going to make the last years all about him. He's not allowing himself to go to pessimism. The enemies that live all around him, they're not his focus. The pressures that Isaac's going to face, how it's going to be hard for him to experience the blessing. Abraham comes up with a plan and he puts it into action, and he doesn't go hands off. He's intentional about doing everything within his power to put the next generation in position to live in the blessing and the promise. A couple of weeks ago, I was over at Jay and Jen Felker's house. They'd thrown a 16th birthday party for their son Hudson. It wasn't the only birthday celebration that he had, but they designed this one to do this. There were 4 generations of spiritual influence gathered together in their house. They'd invited the 2 guys that he greets with every single Sunday out there to be a part of it. They've been pouring into his life over the last couple of years. One of them doesn't have biological children of his own, but he's a whole mess of spiritual descendants, just like Hudson, that he pours his life into. The other one has grown children. They're out of the house, but he's still in the game, launching the next generation. That was one generation. Then Hudson's small group leader was there from the bridge, who started pouring into his life when the small group leader was a college freshman, and has continued all the way along. He's beyond graduation now, still investing in his life. There were some peers that were represented there, 3rd generation, challenging each other, pushing each other to follow Jesus in some real tangible ways that they could point to. And then Hudson's younger brothers were there. All for the purpose of being intentional about passing the blessing along. Blessing him, speaking words of life into him, praying for him. It was awesome. And it wasn't hard. It wasn't weird. It just took some thought. Someone who could spot a moment decided to be intentional about it. What would that look like for you, wherever you're at on this journey? What would it look like for your community group to be a part of this? To get intentional about passing the blessing along. And again, don't misunderstand. Hudson could decide someday to walk away from all of it. He can walk away from the blessing. He can walk away from the promise, just like Isaac's going to have that decision. But Abraham's intentional as far as it depends on him. The baton's not going to get dropped because of his handoff. So at 175 years old, Abraham closed his eyes and he stepped into life, full, satisfied, content. Not because he'd lived a perfect life. Not even because he'd lived a good life for most of his life. But because with his final steps until his last breath, he aimed his life, the blessing and the brokenness, toward the one who'd been faithful through it all. Here's the final word on Abraham in the scriptures. That's where we started the series. It's his final challenge and invitation to us. Think of this as Abraham rounding the home stretch and reaching out a baton to you. Ready for you to take it and to run your race well, all the way through the finish, through the handoff to the next generation. Look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 8, says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They didn't receive the things promised. They just saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God's not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them, for you. Who will the next chapter of your life point towards? Whatever hand you're dealt, however far you are into the race, how far into the future will the ripple of your influence last? Look, we're still naming kids Abraham 4,000 years after this man lived. Not because he was perfect, but because the one who had promised is faithful. Don't drop the baton. Don't just ride off into the sunset. Friends, don't just die. A permanently altered life is an invitation to you to receive life and to extend life, to live towards the promise and extend the promise, to receive the blessing and to pass it along to the next generation. Would you bow your head with me? If you've never received life from Jesus, great news for you. The descendants of Abraham didn't run the race perfectly, but they ran it, and God was faithful. And he sent a descendant, a man named Jesus of Nazareth, who lived a life perfectly, but who died the death of a penalty that you and I owed God. And he offers us life as a gift that costs us absolutely nothing. It's simply something that we can receive by faith. And this morning, if you've never put your trust in him, he offers to take away all of your shame, all of your guilt, all of your past, all of your brokenness, and to make you whole, and to point your life towards the future, and to walk with you towards it. Life that's longer than the breath that you breathe. Lord, for those that are trusting in you for the very first time, Lord, for some of us who have trusted you long before, would you let us live like the life that we live is longer than the breath that we breathe? And would you let us be people who leave a legacy, a spiritual legacy that's better than the one that we received? Would you let us not run the race with narcissism and pessimism and fatalism? Would you let us live it with hope and to extend it with joy and with grace as we finish the race and pass the baton to another generation? We'll carry life and hope and your purpose to the future, not our perfection, but your faithfulness. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.